I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm Sandra Thompson. I am the chair of the board of directors of the LGBT Elder Initiative, and we are very happy to have you with us. The LGBT Elder Initiative is celebrating our 10th year anniversary, and we're very excited about that. This is a third and final program as part of our E10 speaker series. As part of our 10-year anniversary, we have been holding these virtual panels to address pressing issues affecting LGBT older adults. We want to thank our generous sponsors for today's program: Pennsylvania Health and Wellness as our diamond sponsor, and Amera Health Caritas and Philly Age Thrift as our platinum sponsors. These organizations have been great supporters of our work. We are so thankful for their sponsorship of today's program and the rest of our EI10 events. We plan on incorporating lots of opportunity for questions and answers during today's discussion. You can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature. You can find the Q&A button in the toolbar on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We may hold some of your questions until later in the program if it is a topic we plan to cover later in our conversation. For anyone, excuse me, for anyone watching us on Facebook, you can ask your questions as a comment on the video and we will relay them to our panelists. We are grateful to our panelists for joining us this afternoon, and we're very glad they're here. I'm going to ask each panelist to tell us about themselves, give us a short introduction and an overview of their organization, and how your organization is involved in affecting policy change. I'm going to start with Selena Morrison.
Hi, Sandra, and thank you for having me. This is exciting. 10 years, that's great. My name is Selena Morrison, and I am the Executive Director of the Philadelphia Mayor's Office of LGBT Affairs. The Office of LGBT Affairs works to foster equal working and living conditions for the LGBTQ community here and advocate for the LGBT issues in all areas of city government here in Philadelphia. The office, also aims to develop city policy regarding civil rights issues affecting LGBTQ people, as well as help programs to meet the city's diversity and equality goals. Um, uh, we also coordinate among city departments, agencies, and offices to improve LGBTQ access to services. We promote equality and safety for LGBTQ people while also supporting the growth and development of the city's communities and service liaison of the LGBTQ community and the city. I hope that made sense.
Rafael, can you hear us? You're on mute.
Sorry about that. You were on mute. I wasn't sure if you were introducing me or
yeah.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So my name is Rafael Alvarez Febo. I'm the executive director for the Pennsylvania Commission on LGBTQ Affairs. The commission was started via an executive order under Governor Tom Wolf. So our commission lives under the governor's jurisdiction. This was started in 2018, is actually the latest of the 5 commissions that the governor has for affinity groups. So we have a commission on women, commission on African American, Latinx, Asian Pacific American, and the final one, which was started in 2018, which is LGBTQ. So the commission is basically a group of individuals from throughout the Commonwealth. There are about 40 individuals on the commission from all parts of Pennsylvania, representing all aspects of the LGBTQ community, serving on a volunteer basis. The commission's goal and its objective is really to inform the governor and state departments on how to best serve LGBTQ individuals throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We also are really active in legislative policy. So our commission has worked, really hard to help pass the amendment to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, something that has not been done, but we've been really active in the advocacy for that. And that amendment basically would include sexual orientation and gender identity as a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, and allow the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission to enforce non-discrimination laws based on LGBTQ individuals. So, and that's among many other pieces of legislation. So our commission serves as an advisory role. It is, again, a group of 40 volunteers and myself as a staffer that really try to, inform the governor. One of our more recent victories was ensuring that through COVID-19 testing, that we were asking people sexual orientation and gender identity questions on a volunteer basis to ensure we're collecting appropriate data. So again, the commission has really, focused on doing policy work while also ensuring that it's not just legislative, it's also getting state departments to do, to offer better services for individuals. We've been working really closely with the Department of Aging, actually, to inform their plan to include LGBTQ individuals as part of it. And I can definitely talk about that a little bit later. But yeah, we're always busy and always trying to make sure that we can serve Pennsylvanians better.
Thank you, Rafael.
No problem.
Aaron?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aaron Tax. I'm the Director of Advocacy at SAGE, which is the nation's largest and oldest organization dedicated to improving the lives of LGBT older people. I'm in charge of our federal, state, and local advocacy work, where we try to make sure that aging policies are inclusive of LGBT older people, and correspondingly that any advocacy on the LGBT front is inclusive of the needs of older people. In terms of SAGE and a little bit about our history, we've been around since 1978, founded in New York City and still based in New York City, where we run 5 LGBT targeted senior centers. And we have 2 buildings that were, one's running and one's close to being up and running, where LGBT older folks can live and ideally be themselves. In addition to that, we have approximately 30 affiliates in 22 states and Puerto Rico, where they provide some measure of socialization and activities for folks, including one in Philadelphia that many of you probably know about, and another one at the Persad Center right outside of Pittsburgh. In addition to that, we run a federally funded National Resource Center on LGBT aging, which provides information to aging providers, LGBT organizations, and LGBT older people about the needs of LGBT older people and how to better serve their needs. We have Sage Care, which is our training arm, where we train organizations across the country on LGBT cultural competency and credential them depending on their level of training. And that's something that we've worked on with a number of organizations and institutions throughout Pennsylvania, including the Veterans Homes in Pennsylvania and the Pennsylvania Department of Aging. I'm trying to think of anything else I'd want to flag for you guys. I guess the one other thing I would note is during COVID, we launched a program called Sage Connect, where any LGBT person can sign up to receive regular calls. And that was designed to make sure that we address the extra level of social isolation LGBT older people were facing during COVID and continue to face during COVID. So I will pause there, but I'll be happy to answer any questions about SAGE and what we do later on. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Aaron. Really appreciate it. I want to thank all the panelists for their time and energy today. Each panelist will get similar questions. Some are just adjusted slightly depending on whether they're state, local, federal focus. So I'm going to start with Selena, if you don't mind being our first victim. Selena, what are some of the recent policy victories and legislative successes in Philadelphia that benefit LGBTQ older adults?
Okay. Well, seeing that I stepped into this role in March, um, the victories that I can share uh, are, you know, that happened prior to me stepping into this role, but that's going to change soon. But recent policy successes with the office include updates to the Fair Practices Ordinance. Um, the Fair Practice Ordinance, of course, is the city's local anti-discrimination law, and it was enacted in 1963 to prohibit discrimination in Philadelphia in employment, housing, and places of public accommodation. And in 2016, the city enacted legislation that all retail establishments open to general public with single occupancy restrooms must have gender neutral signage. And just in 2019, additional legislation went and expanded to include additional gender neutral restrooms within city controlled buildings, um, including accessible facilities for those with disabilities. So that was actually happening. They were finishing, I think, in with the bathrooms just as I stepped into this role. Right before COVID, I think I may have been in the office for about a week and a half before we were all quarantined. um, so also in 2019, I know the office announced the rollout of the Philadelphia Police Department Directive 4.15, created in collaboration with the community members, city councilmen, of course, the commission. The directive guides unbiased day-to-day interactions with the transgender and non-binary people here in the city, as well as individuals who are being detained or transported. Um, and included in that directive is guidance on respect to individuals' names, pronouns, as well as attention to their specific medical needs. Uh, and within all of those successes, the needs of our senior LGBT community are always inclusive within that. So, yeah, those are some of the successes that we've had.
Lots going on. Thank you, Selena.
Mhm.
Rafael, I'd like to ask you the same question, but with a focus on statewide policies in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely. I think, a little bit about the commission. It was really started out of a work group that the governor, when he first got to office, he started a work group across all of the state departments. And actually, the person that was leading it was Dr. Rachel Levine, health secretary. And the work group really was established to figure out what is going on with departments, right? The state of Pennsylvania is actually the second largest employer in the state. It's a massive organization, and also it serves countless people. It serves 12 million people, right? So we were trying to figure out with the work group what were some policy changes that could be made internally to serve people better. So I started a year and some change ago, right? So a year and probably like 10 days ago. So much like Selena, some of these policy decisions were done prior to me taking the helm. But one of the really important things was PennDOT, so the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, as of this spring of 2020, has started issuing licenses with a gender non-binary marker, right? So, and additionally, you can apply to change your gender marker without any form of, medical documentation or anything that would pose a barrier, right? So it really was something that PennDOT did to update its services, but also it was intended to ensure that Pennsylvanians didn't have to jump through yet another hoop if they were transitioning or if they were non-binary, right? So that's something that was done by PennDOT this year. A little bit, another thing was the establishment of the commission. So after the work group kind of was moving along, the governor felt that it was really important that we get a lot more external stakeholders. So the commission was started in 2018 in order to really start processing more of the policy initiatives that we wanted to address. One of the things I'm really proud of, and it has a lot to do with the aging community, is that our Committee on Aging through the commission has really worked really closely with the Department of Aging to inform the plan on aging, right? So I believe every 4 years, every state department on aging across the nation has to submit a new plan. And the aging committee has been extremely involved in creating a summit where we got many attendees when people could still meet in person. There was a survey that went out to countless stakeholders, and all of that information got turned into recommendations for the state plan on aging. And even the secretary, Robert Torres, for the Department of Aging, held an additional town hall to discuss the state plan on aging. So that was something that really had a lot to do with ensuring people were being trained, that there was cultural competencies for individuals across all agencies that dealt with older individuals in Pennsylvania. And there was a slew of other recommendations involved with it, but I think that it was one of the main things that our commission was able to do through the work of the aging committee was to push to ensure that that plan, and it never before included LGBT anything, right? So like it went from not including any language around LGBT individuals to actually including a really robust amount of language for LGBT Pennsylvanians.
I'm sorry, I was muted. I hate this mute button. Someone just posted, Terry Clark just posted that the plan is posted someplace.
Yes, I don't have the exact link, but the plan is on the Department of Aging's website. So you can, Google Pennsylvania Department of Aging and look up a state plan on aging, and it'll come up.
Thank you very much. Aaron, what's happening at the federal level?
Sure. The most exciting thing that I think most of you have probably heard about is for a long time now, we've been advocating to add LGBT folks as a target population, a so-called greatest social needs population in the Older Americans Act. I'm guessing most of you know the Older Americans Act, but the high level a summary of what that is it's a program, a federally funded program that funds programs like Meals on Wheels, congregate meals, chore assistance, transportation assistance, legal assistance, all these programs that enable older people to age in place in their communities. And there has historically been no mention of LGBT folks. So in the most recent update to this law, the reauthorization that took place this calendar year, we continue to advocate for LGBT inclusion, and namely some language that would make sure that the Aging Network, so organizations like the Philadelphia Department of Aging or the Philadelphia Corporation for Aging and their counterparts around the state and around the country would be held accountable for meeting the needs of LGBT older folks. And certain conservative forces basically precluded us from using the words LGBT in the reauthorization, but we found a way around it. And at the end of the day, if you connect the dots with the language, what you have is a new federal law that requires three things. Number one, that every single state department of aging in the country, whether it's Mississippi or Pennsylvania or everywhere in between, and every AAA in the country, those are area agencies on aging. So there's one in pretty much every county in the country. So if you're in the reddest of red states and the reddest of red counties, even those now have to, one, engage in outreach to LGBT older people, two, collect data on the needs of LGBT older people in their communities, and number three, collect data on whether they're meeting the needs of LGBT older people in their communities, and report that back to the federal government, to the Administration for Community Living on a regular basis. So we're really excited that that language is in the law, and what's going to be happening next are 2 comment periods, and we expect that they'll probably take place in the upcoming calendar year. And the first comment period will be through the Administration for Community Living, where we'll need everyone on this call and all of our friends and allies from across the country to weigh in with ACL to tell them that we want these rules or this law really to be enforced as robustly as possible. And secondly, there'll be another comment period through the Office of Management and Budget where the message will be much the same. And just to give you some context of what this all means and what these comment periods are like, you could imagine if Congress had passed an update to the Endangered Species Act and decided to protect a new animal, maybe it's a butterfly or whatnot. And then the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, would have to come out with rules and regulations about, well, what does it mean to protect the butterfly? And maybe you can't construct buildings near where they live, or maybe you can't pollute near where they live, or so on and so forth. It's kind of the same thing here. The Administration for Community Living has to come out with rules and regulations about what is exactly, what does it mean to engage in outreach? What does it mean to collect that data? How is that data collected? So we're going to be asking things, asking for things to make sure, when these AAAs and the state units on aging are engaging in outreach, that it's really substantive, that it really reaches LGBT older people, and it's not some cursory thing where they put up a pride flag in June and end of story. Like, that's not sufficient outreach. So we want to make sure there's some teeth behind it. And then with respect to the data collection, how are they collecting the data? Are they asking SOGI questions, sexual orientation and gender identity questions, every time they're asking other demographic questions? How are they asking those questions? Are they asking it in a culturally competent way? We don't want people saying like, "You're not gay, are you?" Technically they're asking the question, but they're not going to get a great response if that's how they're asking it. So we want to make sure those questions are asked in a culturally competent way. And same thing, in regards to all the data collection they'll be required to do. So that's what these comment periods are about, and it'll be really important to have the voice of everyone on this call today to share with the Administration for Community Living what we expect from them. And I think it's important to note that we've been on a very much of a defensive posture the last 4 years during the Trump administration, given its relentless attacks on the LGBT community and other communities that we care about. Now we're entering a new phase where we have people who support LGBT equality in charge of the federal government, in charge of the presidency, but we still have a job to do, which is to hold them accountable for meeting the needs of our community. So that's top of mind for us as we move into the new year. The other thing I want to mention is the Equality Act. That's a comprehensive LGBT civil rights bill. We expect that to be introduced in Congress in the new year. And that's really going to ride on, whether it succeeds, it'll really ride on the makeup of the Senate, and if there's a pro-equality majority in the Senate or not. And even then, it's still going to be a challenge because we'll have to get up to 60 votes to overcome an expected filibuster. So we'll have our work cut out for us on the legislative front. And finally, on the legislative front, we're also expecting to introduce a comprehensive LGBT aging bill. So stay tuned on that front as well. Oh, actually, one other thing, I just want to mention it because it's important and it's quick. Many of you might remember under the Obama administration, there was a survey called the National Survey of Older Americans Act participants that for the first time included sexual orientation and gender identity questions. So they were in there for a little while, and then the Trump administration came in and they decided that there was one and only one question they wanted to remove from the survey. Surprise, surprise, it was a sexual orientation and gender identity question. And they said, they didn't say we're a bunch of bigots. Instead, they said the survey was too long. And that was the rationale for removing the question. But be that as it may, we and lots of folks on this call pushed back and got the LGB question put back in, but not the trans question. So one of the big requests for the incoming Biden administration is to make sure they put the trans question back into that survey. So we'll let you know if there's a comment period or how that's going to involve all of us if that's the case. So stay tuned.
Thank you, Aaron. Lots of good information. We've had a couple of people post the link to the PDA website so that you can look at the plan. So feel free to check out the chat and get that information. Our next question, I'm going to start again with Celena. What do you see as the immediate policy priorities in Philadelphia? What policy issues are you and your office most focused on?
I think right now, I mean, well, there's no doubt 2020 has been a difficult year for all of us, but the most marginalized in our society, especially our LGBTQ elders, have disproportionately felt the challenges of this pandemic. So that is right now, I think, foremost always, while we're in this pandemic, is going to always be at the forefront, and that's focusing on the needs of people right now and meeting them where they are. Um, since the onset of the pandemic, the office has dedicated focus to ensuring that the queer Philadelphians, including the elders, the youth, and people with disabilities, have access to the critical recovery resources that are affirming to the community. Now, moving forward, our focus on creating greater equality for our vulnerable communities will be more critical than ever. So we'll be building the office's capacity to facilitate access to city services for our elders. And that's just one of the ways we'll ensure a recovery, that is targeted on supporting our communities with the greatest need.
Thank you, Selena. Rafael?
Yeah, so I think, at the state, we live in a state that's very interesting, right? Pennsylvania has a very large population, but it really does swing left and right politically. And I think that one of the things that has happened, and I can't be extremely political in this response, but for the last decade and some change, we've had a state house that's become more polarized. And with that, it's kind of like at the opposite ends of how our cultural evolution as a country has kind of occurred in this last decade. So, and when I say that, I'm saying, we have marriage equity, and there's like a bigger openness, or a more openness culturally as a country around LGBTQ rights. But our state house and our policies have been actually not falling in line with, where we're going culturally. So just on the policy, priorities, of course, the amendment to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act is paramount, right? This is letting people know that nowhere in the state, and I will say there are many municipalities. I believe there are upwards of 30 municipalities and probably more that have local protections, and that's great. But when you look at the map of Pennsylvania, there are large swaths of places where you're not protected.
Mhm.
And, a lot of these places are usually rural. They're usually, not as culturally open, right? But the problem is that there are not the problem, but the challenge is that LGBT individuals live in all corners of our state. We are a massive state. And thus we have individuals who end up not being protected in communities where they probably need protections the most. So passing the amendment to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. And I like to say that because that's exactly what it is. There's a couple of other nicknames for the Pennsylvania Fairness Act, non-discrimination, but it's really an amendment to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act to add sexual orientation and gender identity to that measure. And what that does is that allows us to then enforce it, right? It's one thing to go and investigate it through the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, which is great. They define they define sex as including sexual orientation and gender identity in their definition of the Human Relations Act, which falls in line with the Supreme Court's ruling for employment. So there are ways of investigating, but enforcement really is contingent on passing that legislation. But there are other legislative priorities where we need to look at banning the trans and gay panic defense law, right? We're talking about individuals who are literally committing crimes, violent crimes, and they're using a defense. And many lawyers don't use this defense, but I mean, it was used recently, right? To say, well, this person had the right to defend themselves against someone based on that person's sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So the straight person is justified in being violent. That is unacceptable. That's something that we're also working on. We're working on including sexual orientation and gender identity and hate crimes, to ensure that if someone does commit a hate crime, that they will be, you know, the law will recognize it as such, but also will work to, like, you know, basically provide justice for the victim, but also ensure that the perpetrator does get some, correctional supports to ensure that they're not, you know, continuing being hateful and bigoted. And obviously that's a lot of work because it's changing someone's hearts and minds, but it is part of the legislation. The other thing is banning conversion therapy for young people, and just banning conversion therapy in general, right? So in Pennsylvania, we have many religious and non-religious conversion camps that, you know, provide, I don't even want to call it a service. They provide something that is, you know, intended to convert someone to being straight, which is something that, you know, we know it causes more damage than good for someone's mental health. So that's another legislative piece, and there's so many others. I think that as a state, we need to really figure out how we can, just get these legislative pieces out there, but also have people on the opposite side of this understand that this is protecting people's civil liberties. This is not infringing on anyone's rights, because your rights end as soon as they infringe on someone else's. And I think that that's very clear anytime someone has done anything bigoted and government has come in to protect people. It was never about infringing on rights. It was always about expanding rights. So Pennsylvania has its work cut out for it. But I think our advocates and people, you know, from all corners of the LGBT community are really ready to fight and do some great work. So, we're committed. We're here. The commission is a facilitating body. It is not the main spearhead of policy, of policy initiatives, but we are here to facilitate this diverse group of individuals. That it's a coalition to bring about these changes. And of course, the general public, call your state reps, call your senators, talk to them about why they won't vote on this, why they won't introduce it, why it won't go to committee, why, because the vote margin is not as bad as people think it is on the floor. It's really committee and leaderships in the committees that block this. Sorry, I kind of went for a while, but just wanted to talk about a couple things.
And I just wanted to jump in and say that the City Office of LGBT Affairs will also be supporting Rafael's office with some of those initiatives, because although we have a lot of protections in place within the city of Philadelphia, once you leave outside of the city, as Rafael said, those protections don't exist, and that has to change.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you, Rafael. Aaron?
Yes, and since it's been a little bit, can you remind me of what the specific question is again?
Sure. Policies. The immediate policy priorities, and now on the national level, and what you and your office are most focused on.
Sure. I think they probably echo what I said a little bit earlier. I think first among them for the new administration, and it seems probably like the easiest fix, will be re-including the trans question in the National Survey of Older Americans Act participants. And again, the reason why this is so important is the Older Americans Act enables people to age and place in their communities. And the survey measures whether the Older Americans Act is meeting the needs of the most vulnerable people or the most at-risk people in our country. So when we're asking the question of whether LGBT folks are able to age successfully in their community, it's hard to know. We might have some anecdotal data or whatnot, but it's hard to know the answer to that question without the data from the federal government. And there's that mantra that if we're not counted, we don't count. I think this is a good example of that. I think in many ways, the Trump administration tried to make LGBT older people and LGBT people more generally invisible. For example, LGBT folks were still not included in the most recent version of the census. And the challenge with this, the lack of data and the lack of this information is the more we try to push the envelope on LGBT-friendly policies and LGBT inclusion, we run into barriers, and the one of the pushbacks we get is, well, we don't have a baseline of data on LGBT people, so you can't hold us accountable for reaching this population if we don't even know what the universe of LGBT people is in our community. So unfortunately, when the other side wins on data collection, it not only makes us invisible, but it also sometimes precludes us from advancing other LGBT-friendly policies, because the pushback is always there that, well, we don't have a baseline of data, we don't know what we're working with, so you can't hold us accountable for reaching these folks. So re-including the trans question in the survey is a step in the right direction. It won't answer all of our questions, but it's a start. Another thing that we're going to be doing is reviewing policies at the Administration for Community Living to determine where they could be made more LGBT friendly. So for sake of example, are there a lot of references or any references to family? And then how is family defined at the Administration for Community Living? Could we make sure that it includes families of choice? That would be really important. So we're looking at all sorts of ways that ACL, the Administration for Community Living, could be more kind of receptive to the needs of LGBT older people to make sure those needs are met. So those are the things I think that are kind of at the top of our inbox in terms of addressing in the new administration. And then of course, trying to get some sort of timetable from ACL, from the Administration for Community Living, on how they plan to implement that Reauthorize Older Americans Act. Because we know we have a limited amount of time and we don't want them to drag their feet, and that LGBT older people don't have forever to wait. So we want them to get to work and start to implement this as soon as possible. And we're aware there's going to be barriers in terms of data, in terms of updating systems and whatnot. And we get that, but it's also not an excuse to move forward. We also get that this is going to be a challenging time for many state units on aging and many AAAs, and that we might get some pushback that they have limited resources and limited time to put into this, especially during COVID. But I got to say, that's kind of one of the arguments we've been hearing for, at least since I've been at SAGE for more than 9 years. Now is not the time. We have waiting lists. Our resources are stretched thin. So, I think the moral of that story for many folks who don't want to do this is it's never the right time, and they never have enough resources, and there's always a waiting list, which means they're never ever going to do it. And I think we're done with those arguments because we've heard them too many times before. I think the response to that, it's now more than ever, because LGBT older folks, much like many other folks, are really challenged by COVID-19, and they're particularly challenged in terms of social isolation and some of these other barriers to successful aging. So I think our response to that is now more than ever.
Thank you very much. We clearly have a lot of work to do. This question is for all of you, and we can go in any order, anyone who wants to begin. What are the ways that community members and community-based organizations can contribute to the advocacy efforts and policy changes? Anyone?
Well, I've been going first, so I'll go. But I think, first of all, I think service on an advisory board or committee is one important way to ensure that the needs of the community are being heard. In the coming year, my office will be focusing on building the capacity of the Mayor's Commission on LGBT Affairs and ensuring that that is reflective of the diverse community that we serve. So look for that. Representation across all aspects of identity, I think, is crucial to ensure equitable distribution of our resources within our communities. Yeah.
I think, something that's really important, and I come from an organizing background, and I think that, there's so many community organizations that, like Selena said, people are working with individuals, and there's some, just life-saving needs that those organizations work with. And I think, it's really important to then figure out how to mobilize everyone that interacts with your organization to say, okay, well, once we understand what the needs are, right, and we see a reoccurring issue, it's really important to mobilize your clients, your constituents, your members, however you classify the people you interact with, right, as a community organization or community group, and really say, okay, well, now it's time to mobilize. This is the stumbling block. This is the policy problem. This is the law. This is the thing that's a barrier, right? And I think that that's when we go from service to advocacy. And I think that some of the most successful advocacy is always connected with ensuring that your clients, your members, your however you classify the individuals you work with have their basic needs met, right? Because I saw a question here about housing. Housing is huge. If someone doesn't have housing, it's going to be really hard for them to get a job, to get food, to cook the food, to learn how to eat healthier, to take their meds on time. All of those things are impacted by your environment. And I think that the advocacy that these organizations can have is huge. Getting contact information, getting everyone that's a member of your organization, getting their contact information, letting them know, look, there's something going on. This is who you call. This is advocacy. There's a law happening in Harrisburg right now. There's a law in Philly. There's a law in Pittsburgh. There's a law in Charleroi, PA, that's happening, and we need you to call and advocate. I think that that is the most useful way that organizations can really engage to create change, while also serving those individuals with the needs, the needs that they have the most.
Thank you.
Yes, in terms of how folks can, contribute, there's going to be these comment periods regarding the Older Americans Act language that I referenced. So we will be, shouting from the rooftops when those opportunities start. And I think one thing that you could start thinking about doing right now is that you do have some great allies in the Pennsylvania Department of Aging and the Philly Corporation for Aging, is to start reaching out to them and preparing them for these comment periods. We'd like them to weigh in, because that's going to be a particularly powerful voice. If the governor's office wants to weigh in, if there are area agencies on aging AAAs in the more rural parts of the state, I think that would be particularly powerful to share that voice about why they think outreach is important, why they think data collection is important, why it's not terribly time consuming or a huge burden, and why it in fact improves the services and supports that they can provide. I think sharing all of those messages and changing the narrative around it from being a burden to helping them do their job better, I think is important, for them to tell that story. So I think, start thinking about the contacts that you have in the aging network around the state, and thinking about how we can get them to lend their voice to the comment periods. That'd be great.
Thank you. Rafael referred to one of the questions in the chat. The question is, with the high rate of homelessness in Philadelphia, is any attention being given to the LGBT older adult and their needs, as well as COVID concerns? Celena, do you?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we released our Coping with COVID LGBTQ resource guide that we continue to update weekly to bi-weekly. I am in constant contact with all of the local organizations, the LGBT serving organizations, to make sure that that information is updated, to make sure that the most current information is provided for everyone. I can drop the link to that resource guide in the chat, but we do our best to try to make sure that those resources that are available to folks are updated. The homeless services that are available, what little they are updated as well. Access to food, anything, all of the resources in there are tailored to fit the LGBT community.
I would add, so I think, we know that a large proportion of homeless individuals identify as LGBT, especially young people. And I think that, one of the things we need to start looking at when it comes down to figuring out how to better serve and provide these resources is figuring out how we add LGBT as marginalized class, right? So I think that, we have and again, a lot of the homeless services are mandated through federal and then state kind of regulations, right? So we do have some very specific things that we have to serve, or people we have to serve, and populations. I say we as government people, and I'm not housing individuals, but the Pennsylvania Housing Financing Agency has some very specific markers that they use, whether it's race and socioeconomic status and zip codes and but there's really no space currently for sexual orientation and gender identity. But we know that for young people, again, like I said, I think it's a 40% of young people that are homeless identify as LGBT, 30 to 40% that we know of. And then on the other side of the age scale, you have a lot of older adults identifying as LGBT because of the lack of specific family structures and care, right? So I think we're at a place that we need to figure out, like Aaron was saying, to collecting this data and saying, well, actually, what we're seeing is that these services are really needed by these specific populations, and saying, okay, these populations should be given, a little bit of a priority, right, for services, for finding new funding, because one of the things that we don't discuss as much is that supportive housing is very expensive, right, according to the models that we have currently. So, you have supportive housing, and sometimes, providing someone housing, it's about, $30,000 a year or something along those lines. And, obviously, if someone has better numbers than me, please shout them out. I'm not the authority on this, but it costs a lot to have supportive housing. And I think that, figuring out how to really find a middle space, right, where some people need absolute supportive housing with all types of wraparound services, and other people kind of are in this gray area where they don't need all the wraparound services, but they do need the housing. And I think that, again, the most important thing is figuring out and allowing LGBTQ individuals to get, just like if racial data helps fund housing in certain communities, we need to figure out how LGBT data also helps amplify and grow the pie, right? We're not talking about using the same resources. We really need to grow the pie and the pool of resources and funding for housing and all types of other services. So this is about growing it. This isn't about kind of taking from other communities.
Yeah. This coming year, I know we will also be meeting with some funders to kind of brainstorm where to redirect these funds. So one of the things I will definitely be discussing with them is our LGBTQ elder community.
Aaron, did you have any comment you wanted to make about that question? I know it's a very broad question nationally, but.
Yeah, I don't know if there's anything specific I would add to that specific one.
Thanks. Okay.
Yeah.
Another question. Most local ordinances don't have enough teeth. Philadelphia is the exception, and the laws are great. The cost of putting in a legal complaint can be as much as $250,000, and risk paying other sides and risk paying the other side's costs. So beyond the panic defense, is there anything being done to ensure LGBT people can actually use the laws?
So I'll take this a little bit. So currently, the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission does define sex as including sexual orientation and gender identity, right? So if people have a complaint or specific legal challenge that they would like to take, they should look at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission in order to use their framework, their attorneys, to put in the complaint, to do an investigation in order to possibly fight some discrimination that they're facing. Again, local ordinances would go to their local Human Relations Commission. But if there's some localities that don't have ordinances, they should go to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission website and put in their legal complaints there. But again, until we actually spell it out in the law, it's always more of a challenge. So yes, there's definitely some barriers to legal repercussions. And I think, you know, like I said earlier, changing people's hearts and minds is always going to be a challenge that we have to figure out as a community. But legally, the Human Relations Commission is the authority on those kinds of complaints and legal concerns.
You know, one thing I would recommend also is if someone is in the position they feel like they need to file a complaint, is to reach out to one of the LGBT legal advocacy organizations. And even if they can't take your case, they might be able to give you some advice. So that might be Lambda Legal, for example, the ACLU LGBT Rights Project, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and others who can at least help kind of walk you through the process a little bit, I suspect.
We have a SAGE question, actually, Aaron. After SAGE training at agencies, does SAGE go back to look to see if agencies have done any suggested implementations? Does SAGE address agencies with that generational divide to ensure that the client is treated with respect and care?
That's a great question. I don't know all the ins and outs of the training part of SAGE since I don't do that on a daily basis. But my understanding is to maintain a credential. So for example, if you're a SAGE Platinum credentialed provider, that a certain percentage of your staff would have to be regularly trained to a certain degree. So it might be, I'm just making this up, but maybe 80% of your staff has to have 8 hours of training or whatever the case is, every 2 years or something like that. So I think there's a way to make sure that people, it's not like it's one and done and then they get this credential and they can just, free ride on that for years and years and years and not, update what they're doing and be held accountable in any way. I'm not sure about, kind of the specifics of, say they do something wrong or, what happens in that scenario. But it's a good question. And, if anyone has specific questions about that, I'd recommend that they go to the Sage Care website and they could probably find answers to those questions there or reach out to the person who responds to those questions and get some specific answers.
Thank you.
Yep.
We have a question from Ellen Bloomfield, who's with the San Mateo County Pride Center. Welcome, Ellen. What are your ideas for outreach with LGBTQ plus older adults? I'm the older adult coordinator at the San Mateo County Pride Center. We are having a tough time locating older adults, and when we do, it's often in crisis.
So I'm Googling some resources right now, and I would encourage you to check out SAGE's National Resource Center on LGBT aging. And so right now there's some featured resources on the site. So I'm going to send you a link to this in the chat. But one of them that seems like it could be relevant is a practical guide to creating welcoming agencies. That might have some information that you're looking for. In addition to that, I would encourage you to reach out to the general email address, or I'm happy to put you in touch with the person who runs the resource center, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel. And I imagine a lot of other entities around the country find themselves in a similar situation where they want to do the right thing, but they're not sure exactly where to start and how to find LGBT older folks in their community. I think as a general rule of thumb is if you have an LGBT center in your community or equivalent organization, and it might be the community next door. So it might not be in San Mateo, but maybe it's in the next county over, to reach out to them, explain your dilemma and say you're trying to reach people in your community, and they might be able to introduce you to some folks. And then maybe from there, it can snowball a little bit because maybe you get introduced to some folks and they can introduce you to their friends and their networks. So I think the hardest part is probably just starting that process. And from there, you can kind of network out and reach more and more people that way. But I think, looking into the local LGBT institutions or organizations in your community is a great way to start. There are, LGBT affiliated religious organizations like the Metropolitan Community Churches. There are the Prime Timers, which is kind of like a national LGBT older kind of person social group. And yeah, so they might not be in your specific community, but they might be near your community. So that might be a good way to start.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the other panelists? But thank you very much, Aaron.
Sure.
Um, One of the things I want to refer folks to is the chat. There are a number of links, thank you very much, have been put in the chat that may be of interest to a number of you. So
Sandra, I think those are all to the resource guide. I think it was just entered a number of times.
Okay. And then there was the one for the state plan.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. What would it look like to mandate cultural competency training for all agency service providers? And once an agency gets trained, is there follow-up to make sure are they making changes and applying what they've learned? This is similar to the question you just answered.
I think
you answered earlier, Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, there are some models in the country. So Massachusetts has a cultural competency training requirement. There's one in California. And then Sage was excited to work with Mary Che, who's a council member in DC. And DC now has a LGBT cultural competency training requirement. So I think there are models that you can look to, and they differ a little bit. So Massachusetts is a little broader. I think it touches anyone getting funding from the Massachusetts Department of Aging. But I think the requirements might be a little bit looser. Don't quote me on that. And then the one in California, I believe, is more specific to long-term people working in long-term care settings. And then the rules are a little bit more specific or a little bit more prescriptive. So I think there's different models that we can look at across the country. I believe the DC version of this is modeled more on California than Massachusetts. But those are a good starting point.
Thank you. I'm looking at the chat and I'm looking at the Q&A.
Can I add something
Sure.
to that? So
I think, absolutely.
Yeah, I think with trainings and with all types, anything that has to do with HR, it's about how do you institutionalize it, right? So there are many instances where someone will take a training once, right? They'll do the training once and then that's it, right? I think that we need to make sure that, institutions, the state of Pennsylvania, like I said, we have 60,000 employees or something north of that. How do you train people throughout an entire system? Not just to, take the training, because all of our trainings are online, right? But how do you train them to, make sure that they're providing the best services and not just, end with the trainings that are about HR and interpersonal organizational issues, right? So I think, making sure that these things are institutionalized and really tying them to some interpersonal interactions, because I see it all the time. Our sexual harassment training was an online slideshow. And those are things that are really not changing people's cultural awareness. It's just giving them mandated language. So I really do think that there's something to cultural competency, but it's just ingraining it into all of our practices, whether it's putting your pronouns on your signature. It doesn't hurt anyone. It costs nothing. But these are little things that are not so small, right? When you have it across an entire institution. So really, I think, trainings, we need to get out of you do one training and then for the rest of your life, you're LGBT proof, like that's not how it works. This is an evolution. This is a very, a way to break down learned behavior that, comes from it bombards people from all portions of society. So I think, the trainings are valuable, but constant trainings, updated trainings, and the interpersonal touch that makes it actually, become more of a values thing than it does, just a workplace nuisance.
I'd like to think of it as not everyone that passes a driver's test and gets a license can actually drive. There's a lot more to it than that. Are there I think I've got another question. Is there anything being done to make Philly's LGBT spaces, the neighborhood, for example, more inclusive and accessible in terms of class, race, sexism, ageism, etc.?
Yes, that is always a conversation that we're having. I know that that has been an ongoing problem here in the city. And, you know, those conversations had actually, I had actually started to have some of those conversations prior to stepping into this role. To be quite transparent, those conversations pretty much halted, you know, with COVID. We stopped meeting with them, with the bar owners and the club owners because they weren't open. Now, since folks had started to gather again in the neighborhood, some of those concerns have resurfaced. Of course, they have not been addressed, so they're going to be resurfaced. So we have begun to start having those conversations again. I think that will be one of the issues once we have established a good size commission that represents our community. I think we will have the capacity at that time to really take those issues head on.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any.
I think
too
it's
soon.
Bill S. I agree. It is definitely about the responsiveness. I think competency is just a term that people have thrown around there. But I think it's a cultural shift, right? I think that's really what we want. These trainings and all of these other laws and everything that we're putting there is to put a cultural shift that says, you know, people deserve dignity in every space. They deserve to have the same rights as other people, and their whole self is something that needs to be respected, not just parts of them. So just wanted to address that.
Thank you. We've had a wonderful discussion. I'd like to ask the panelists if there's anything else they would like to say before we close out this afternoon. And we don't even have to go in order. Celena, you don't even have to go first.
Well, I will. I'll just say, well, I'll just say to everyone, just to stay safe, wash your hands, and please wear a mask.
Well, one thing I'm thinking about is it's important for us to, you know, change the framing on a lot of these issues. And I think often when we're asking organizations, I'll just use the phrase as a catch-all, even despite the previous discussion, to be more culturally competent and to do more outreach and to meet the needs of the LGBT community. We can view this more as an opportunity and a way to facilitate them doing their job even better and more effectively. Because, you know, of course, they're not doing their job if, you know, there's a whole segment of the population that's not being served. So our goal is not to push LGBT folks in front of the line or anything along those lines, but simply to make sure that they're, you know, being treated equally with everybody else on a level playing field with everybody else. And, you know, I think all of us in this space have been doing this work for a long time, and we're willing, you know, to be their partners as they go down that road.
Sorry, I'm muted. I want to thank Selena, Rafael, and Aaron for their time today. I also want to thank all of you that registered and participated today. This was a really good turnout. I'm very excited about it. I want to invite you all to join us on January 14th for our Cause for Applause that is being held virtually. You can, there's more information on, there's more information on our website. And that's lgbtelderiniative.org. We're celebrating 10 years. That's a major milestone, and we'd love to have you all with us. And we also want to thank again our sponsors for today's program, Pennsylvania Health and Welfare, Philly AIDS Thrift, and AmeriHealth Caritas. Thank you all for being with us today. I want to echo what Celena has said. Please be safe. Please wear your masks. If not for you, then for me. Thank you all very much and have a good day and rest of your afternoon. Thank you.